So you can see that we've talked so far primarily about the flight controller and the flight service. Now we're going to go ahead and talk about some of the microservices. And we'll start with one that's really simple. Let's start with airport. That's a very simple one. So airport is a microservice. You've seen the airport microservice before, but you haven't seen it with reactive capabilities. And this runs as a Spring application. As you can see here, it's a Spring Boot application. It is what's called a discovery client, a Eureka discovery client. And what that means is that it's capable of auto-registering with Eureka, as we will see here shortly. And then that allows it to be discovered by the flight's app gateway, the front-end app gateway or API gateway, that it's able to discover all the different microservices. So we're now back over here in the airport application, and we made this thing a discovery client. We looked at the properties file that is indicated with that. And as part of that process, what's going to happen is it's going to go ahead and register itself with Eureka. And here is the way that this gets done. Let's see. Somewhere, here we go. This is the Eureka client properties. If you look up here, you can see properties sources. One of them was Eureka client properties, and that corresponds to this particular property file. So this is the property file that each of the microservices in this particular implementation use. So we indicate the port number is 0, which says, hey, Eureka, you pick the port. I don't care. So obviously, Eureka is going to have a little database that uses internally to keep track of a mapping of a microservice to port number. Yeah. And then we also indicate where the Eureka server is running. And that Eureka service that's where this particular app knows to find Eureka. Of course, we can control that. We aren't hard coding it, just putting it in the configuration file. And then there's a bunch of other little flags down here that indicate various things that we want this microservice to be true or enabled with respect to Eureka. So we want to be able to use the Spring Cloud Balancer instead of Netflix Ribbon. We want to turn on Eureka Discovery for this microservice. We want to register this thing automatically with Eureka. And we also want to set things up so there's a cache to make the lookups go faster. Now that we've kind of seen a configuration file for a microservice, let's go back and look at the microservice. This is pretty much par for the course. Oh, there's also a database properties file you can see here that indicates some things about the database. It sets username and password just for testing purposes. We wouldn't do this in a production system like that. And control the way the tracing is done and so on. So you can see here that we've got the airport application. Most of it's set up through configuration, as you can see here. We also have a controller. The controller is a controller like our earlier controllers, except this is now a controller for a microservice. No real difference, actually. It's a REST controller. It is required for Eureka redirection to use cross-origin. It's got response body enabled for all the different methods. There's just one method here. And then we go ahead and we auto wire the airport controller to the airport service. And we have the get airports method that just forwards to the service. So if we go look at airport service, this auto wires to the airport repository. And that, of course, is going to be used to store all the information about the airports. And as you can see here, get airports is just a method that goes to the repository and says, find all. And this is the part that's really cool. So you can see here that get airports is going to return a flux of airports. It calls repository find all. And if you look at the airport repository, you can see that the airport repository is implemented as a reactive Crud repository. And that, of course, is different from, say, JPA repository, which is what we've been doing heretofore. And this creates a repository that has methods built into it like find all that return fluxes or monos, but in this case, a flux, because we're doing find all, as opposed to returning a list. So you can see that we're able to push this stuff all the way down into the database component. So the databases themselves are returning reactive types. So now we're going to be able to be reactive throughout the entire system. And that's, I think, very powerful and very cool. So that's a very simple example of a microservice, but I think it's pretty good as a basis because you can see how we can make this a discovery client. We can enable the use of the R2DBC reactive database, what it's going to work with, set up the entity and component scans, set up the property sources, and then everything else just kind of falls out as it always does. The Exchange application, the Exchange microservice works almost exactly the same way. The difference, of course, is that for Exchange, it's got Exchange properties, which is mostly just the name. Everything else is pretty much the same. Obviously, the schema and the data for the Exchange is a little bit different. A production application would do something a bit more clever than what we're doing here. We're just hard coding these numbers in there. But that was just to kind of get all the pieces to fit together in something that could be explained fairly quickly. And if we go back up here, you can see that we have an Exchange controller, which is auto-wired to the Exchange service. We've got a get rate method and a get rates method. Both of those things just go ahead and forward to the underlying service. Should probably make that more clear here. And it's doing that, but should be no real surprise for this. You've seen this before. And then if we go look over here at the Exchange service, this is going to go look up in the repository and do the appropriate mapping of from currency to currency. And there's a couple different ways to find things. And if you look at the repository, you can see that this is also a reactive Crud repository, just like the one we looked at for the airport service, the airport microservice before. And again, all very straightforward kinds of things. But the cool part here is that these again return reactive types, either mono in the case of find by from currency and to currency, and a flux for find by to currency. So the only thing that's really left here to look at are the airline microservices. And as you can see, we have a couple of them, one for American Airline, one for Southwest Airlines. Of course, I could add many more. This is just for examples purposes. And there's a common portion here. So the bulk of the code goes in the common portion. And again, there's a controller, which has got an auto-wired service. That should be no surprise. It's got a method called find flights, and a method called find best price. Those things just forward to the service. And you can see the service is wired to a repository. This should start looking very familiar, same pattern over and over again. And find flights goes ahead and looks up in the database, the asynchronous reactive database, to find everything that matches that departure and arrival and date tuple. And then find best price is going to go ahead and do a find flights call, followed by using that same cheapest price collector that we looked at before to find the cheapest prices and return them as a flux. So that's all pretty much the same. And then the only real differences between the American Airlines and the Southwest Airlines application, the only real difference is we just change where the properties come from. Everything else is the same. So if you look at these two files, this one gets its stuff from SWA properties, which is right here. It just says SWA-airline, whereas American Airlines gets it from AAL-airline. And those, of course, are what will be registered with Eureka, and how you can ask Eureka for a list of all the services, microservices it knows about, and you can search for them by name or by substring, which is what we do here. So the cool part about all this stuff is that by using things in the way we've shown, the entire solution is asynchronous. And if we have the good fortune of having asynchronous clients, which we could do if we had a Java client or probably a JavaScript client on a browser, then the entire solution can be reactive from stem to stern, from top to bottom, which is super cool. If you go ahead and run the tests, I'm not going to do that right now because we're getting short of time. If you run the tests here, you can see there's a lot of tests and they all work. No surprise there. But that exercises all the different methods that we've seen in different ways.